What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
Investors,
Experts, diplomats,
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy
the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listen to our first few episodes, then you know that over the past few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where we hear directly from people in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of these conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today we're releasing a portion of a recorded conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with CNN's chief international correspondent, Clarissa Ward. And the insights she shared with us about the real human elements of her experience were fascinating. We hope you enjoy the conversation as much as we did. She recently wrote a book, On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist, where she shares many stories, including those we talked about and others. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to see our schedule of upcoming events, find out how to join us live, maybe ask one of our guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all of that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Clarissa, I just wanted to get into, for people, as CNN's chief international correspondent, you've obviously contributed segments to both CNN International, and I mean, lately you've been all over CNN Domestic, bringing what is happening in Afghanistan to U.S. viewers here stateside. But many may not know. Can you tell us about the difference of these two arms of CNN and how they either are similar or maybe there's some differences between what's going on?
Sure. So CNN basically has two networks, as you said. Well, actually, it has more networks than that. There's CNN en Espanol. There's CNN Domestic, which is what you see in the U.S., and then there's CNN International, which is seen around most of the world. The big difference between domestic and international is that obviously international covers the U.S. heavily, but it's not domestic focus per se. It has a more global outlook. I would say on average, it changes a bit. During the election, we were what we call simulcasting pretty much the entire time, which means when you air CNN Domestic on CNN International as well. And that went on for a while because with COVID and everything, we had to streamline operations for control room reasons, et cetera. Now I would say CNN International has about 14 or 12 hours a day of distinct programming of its own. And CNN Domestic obviously has its own programming for, I believe, 20 hours a day. There's some overnight hours where they actually simulcast CNN International. So that's roughly the difference between the two. As a correspondent who works for both of them, it can sometimes be pretty intense when you're on a big story because both networks want you all the time. So you can be doing 2 live shots an hour.
Double the work, double the fun. So you were outside. Everybody knows you, at least now for this. I've been following your career for a while, but you were outside the gates of the airport in Afghanistan after Kabul fell from the Taliban. It was a massive transition of society, of the way that people will live their lives then. And now we've all read your stories. We've all watched your TV segments. I'm wondering if you can tell us what we can't find out from television or reading your stories, only what we can kind of find out from being there and almost experiencing this as it happened.
I mean, in terms of like raw basic knowledge and data, I think you can obviously get a lot from reading as much as you can. What is very difficult to get from reading or watching television is to like really get a feel for the place, a sense of what, the air smells like, what the energy feels like, to feel connected to the people. That's much harder to do, even if you're a voracious consumer of all the types of reporting that are available on Afghanistan. Obviously, if you're not there in person, it's much harder to feel that level of connection with a place and with a story. And I would also just say that when you're on the ground, you're having conversations with people all the time. So you're always learning more. You're always picking up little tidbits. You're always making observations that in some minute way inform your viewpoint or understanding of a conflict. And these observations won't usually make it onto the evening news, but it's much more subtle than that. So obviously, just through reading and watching, you wouldn't be privy to those subtleties. And that's part of actually why I wrote my book, by the way. That's not just a shameless plug. I mean it as a genuine segue. It's part of the reason I wrote it is because there are so many moments that happen behind the camera that are hugely rich and informative and illuminating that never make it to the evening news. And so I wanted a place to share those.
Clarissa, I kind of wanted to jump into maybe a story that you can give us from actually a very interesting, probably dangerous report that you did and get some insight into it. When you were interviewing a terrorist, such as example, recent story you had with the ISIS-K leader, my question, I've always wondered this, how do you balance the potential newsworthiness with the fact that this person may not be a reliable source and the potential harm that giving them a global platform could cause?
Yeah, it's a really good question. First of all, like you cannot put anyone on television or publish any interview with someone who's a member of a terrorist group unless you're really sure that they are who they say they are and you have excellent sources to confirm that. That can get you into a whole lot of trouble. And it's also a complete waste of everybody's time. And it could potentially even be dangerous. So your first thing is like you really need to do your due diligence and know that the person that you're talking to is legit. And in a situation like my most recent interview with the ISIS-K commander, I was working with someone I have worked with before, who I trust implicitly, who has spent time with this group. I have seen videos and have a lot of information that left me in no doubt that he is who he says he is. So then in terms of answering your second question about sort of giving them a platform, I would say two things. I would say, first of all, like you have to be careful about airing propaganda videos for that reason, because then you really are just giving them free airtime, right? I try to avoid using propaganda videos. Sometimes you use them sparingly, but never gratuitously. But I do think at the same time, it's really important to understand the mindset of these groups, right? Especially a group like ISIS-K, especially if Americans are no longer on the ground in Afghanistan. How are we supposed to know who these guys, who they really are, what they're about, what their motivations are, what their plans are? So I definitely think it's legitimate and even important to have conversations with people who we may find to be evil or morally reprehensible or dangerous or whatever the case may be. It's about having the conversation in a mature and sensible way whereby you're trying to extract information that is legitimately of public value, such as what's your ideology, what are your plans, what are you intending to do, do you intend harm to Americans, do you intend harm to people in other countries, etc. So it's all about really just, I think, striking that balance. And it's a hard balance to strike. And, there are times where I think the media doesn't always get it right. I think with the ISIS-K commander we did, I also think it meant something that we didn't show his face, and we also disguised his voice, because I do think that has a dehumanizing effect, which is probably a positive thing when you're interviewing someone um, with a group like ISIS-K.
So, quick follow up. When you're interviewing somebody who is truly heinous and wants to subjugate women and just violate all types of human rights, how do you go into that interview as impartial and unbiased as possible, trying to create, a more neutral platform when maybe you have all of these raw emotions of, hatred and whatever else is going through your mind?
Yeah, I mean, well, this one wasn't. I interviewed Anjem Chowdhury, who went to jail ultimately in the UK for his role in kind of inspiring young ISIS recruits in the UK. And I interviewed him after my friend Jim Foley had been murdered by ISIS in the most brutal way possible. That was a challenge, right? To look someone in the eye who is rude and nasty, who follows this, he doesn't even openly follow it. He sort of dances around questions to avoid getting into trouble, although eventually trouble came to him. I mean, in that sort of a situation, it's hard. It's hard to keep your cool. But let me tell you, in my experience as a television journalist, the minute you lose your cool, the minute you raise your voice or start getting angry, or you are losing the battle. You are handing them that interview. You are handing them control of that situation. You have got to keep your cool in an intense interview like that, whatever your personal experiences may be. You can challenge them. You can push them. You can even make it clear that you think they're a disgusting human being, but you let them answer the questions. You Often I find in these situations, you give them enough rope to hang themselves, let them talk a bit, let them have their say, and you'll be amazed what sometimes people will say in that sort of a situation. But the minute you really start to lose your cool, you've lost the battle.
That had to be very difficult. I'm sorry about your friend as well. As a quick refresher, folks, this is Politics and Media 101 with CNN international correspondent Clarissa Ward. She's won so many awards that it would take me the rest of our interview to read them all off. But if you want to kind of get some of her experiences firsthand, she wrote a book published roughly a year ago today, On All Fronts by Clarissa Ward. I'm going to have maybe a couple more questions for you, and then we will go to our esteemed audience for their questions. So you've reported from war zones, which, again, I think your Instagram account went from like 60,000 followers, I read in the New York Times, to over 250 over just this last kind of experience. And everybody knows the war zones, right? Syria with the Russians bombing a fruit market, Iraq, Afghanistan. You've also reported, though, from other areas like the Central African Republic, where you had mercenaries tracking you, Myanmar, where there was maybe a genocide and a crackdown on all types of press. I'm wondering, what would you consider the most dangerous situation you've been in? And then how did you try and stay cool throughout that situation?
It's a good question. I think there's a few. I think the one that's popping into my mind, which is one of the earliest sort of near-death experiences I had, was at the Palestine Hotel in Baghdad in 2005. I was 25 years old. I was freelancing as a producer for Fox News. And we came under attack, basically. A series of suicide car bombings followed by a massive cement mixer truck filled with explosives that actually got stuck on some razor wire about 100 yards from the hotel. And so the the driver, the bomber, knew that someone was going to kill him pretty quickly if he didn't blow himself up. So he blew himself up. That's the only reason that we're alive today, is because he was still about 100 yards away. But in that moment, because it was a series of bombings and we understood that the bombings were kind of part of a complex attack on our hotel, I would just say that the way you stay cool is it's a strange thing that happens in moments like that, because you actually, and this is different for everyone, but for me, when I'm desperately frightened, I basically shut down. I get very quiet, very small, and I mean, there's all sorts of things going on inside of me and in my mind, but on the outside, I seem like completely calm. And so I guess that's why it makes sense that I'm able to do this kind of work, because I think if you're someone who, when they get really scared, panics or gets loud or animated, that could be pretty dangerous. But in my mind, what's going on, it's like a constant battle of trying to calm yourself, trying to keep focused on what it is that you need to be doing, or getting out, or getting to safety, or finding your colleagues, or whatever it is that the primary focus is. It's about trying to stop your mind from running away with kind of sort of panic thoughts of what could happen, and try to stay very focused on like what is happening.
So after getting out of an area like that, where you're either trying to calm yourself down, or the fruit market in Syria, where you interview these people that just suffered human atrocity, how strange is it kind of to witness almost the worst of humanity, to put yourself in situations of serious danger, like you mentioned, suicide bombing, and then maybe after a week, 5 days, you're next in metropolitan New York, Paris, London, Doha, where life is quote unquote back to normal, and you just see the extreme worst and best of society kind of juxtaposed. What's it like to go from that such a dire situation and then just be back in normal society?
It's hard. It's really hard. And it gets a little easier as you get more used to it, because you know what you're going through and you know what to expect. But it doesn't, it, it I think what you really struggle with, there's a couple of things you struggle with. First of all, I tend to often feel when I come back, now it's a little different. I have kids, because it's not really possible for me to feel detached from my kids. But before I had kids, I would come back and just feel very detached from my life, and even from my friends and my family. And I just feel kind of numb, and not depressed, but not happy, just kind of tired and a little irritable, and just really feel kind of nothing, basically, which is actually more of a sign of depression than feeling sad is, in a funny sort of way, or it can be. Nowadays, as I said, it's a little different because I have kids, but still, you have that sense of feeling a little detached from your ordinary life. The other thing that is a huge struggle is trying to make sense of why it is, I think they call it survivor's guilt, why it is that I get to leave these places and go back to a life of privilege and have my children be safe and secure and happy and well fed and with a roof over their head, and all of these privileges that all of us at one time or another take for granted. So it's hard to make sense of that, how the randomness of life, the randomness of the fact that I have this little blue passport that means that I am entitled to certain things that a lot of people in the world would give anything to have, and don't get to have. And that's not an easy thing to unpack or make sense of. I don't think it gets any easier. You find ways to to live with it. But I think that's a big part of the challenge of constantly kind of shuttling back and forth between two different worlds.
On that note, folks, we're doing the audience portion of our session here. So please wait for your name to be called on. Please be really short so that we can get through as many of Clarissa's fans as possible, because I know you're all fans. And then 3, obviously, if you're not a fan, that's fine. Just be respectful. So from that note, I'm going to go first to Judith, and then after Judith, we will hit Dawn.
Thank you so much, Justin and Clarissa. I wanted to thank you for the work you've done in the Navalny case. Your bravery in showing up at Operative Tayakin's door continues to blow my mind. My question is, do you keep up with the political response to your reporting, for instance, on the Navalny case? And if so, how do you process it or deal with it when you feel like the political response isn't proportional to what happened? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. It's a good question. I mean, it's hard because on the one hand, of course, you want to you want to stay on top of it, and you want to make sure if you've done some type of reporting where you feel like there really should be a response, you very much want to stay on top of it and try to do whatever you can to make sure that the people in power who are making decisions see your report, are aware of what's happened. And it is, I'm not going to lie, I've had this many times in my career where it is a little heartbreaking to think that despite all the risks you take and the efforts you make, your reporting ultimately does not change policy in one way or another. Now, I would experience that sense of disappointment much more acutely when I was younger, particularly when I was covering the war in Syria. I remember really struggling with that at times because I was witnessing such intense atrocities on a regular basis, and it felt like it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't affecting anyone's abilities to try to mitigate the suffering of the Syrian people. Nowadays, and I write about this in my book as well, I try to really focus on what my role and responsibility is, which is not to solve the problem, but to put a spotlight on it. And if I worry too much about solving the problem, I find that, first of all, I lose my focus a little bit and I end up getting disappointed. Whereas if I really try to keep a laser focus on highlighting the problem, putting a spotlight on it, giving a voice to people who might not have a voice, or holding people in power accountable, or whatever it might be, depending on what the story is, then I find I'm better able to do my job as a journalist, and I'm better able to sleep at night at the end of it, because there's so much baggage doing this work anyway, that if you're also trying to take on the responsibility of making the world a better place, honestly, it becomes a little bit unbearable and I think unsustainable. And so I realized during the Syrian conflict that if I was going to be able to do this in the long term, I was going to have to take a more focused approach to the work and just accept the fact that I did not have control, and nor should I have control over what the political fallout or outcome of any story I do is.
Thank you for that question, Judith. We will go to Donna, and then after Donna, we will go to Jeff, my co-moderator.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks, Clarissa. Clarissa, I've enjoyed following your reporting over the years, and I really like these comments that you've made on this talk about not losing your cool as you're reporting in the field. And what would your advice be as a woman, as a journalist, as a Westerner who's doing this work abroad for women who are coming along in the field?
That's such a good question, Donna, and thank you also for your kind words. I mean, I have a few pieces of advice. First of all, I always tell, because I have a lot of young reporters coming to me, I always say very bluntly, you got to want this real bad. Like, from the fire of your belly, you have to want this, because there are a lot of people who are trying to do this kind of work. It's very competitive. And also, it's not for the faint of heart. And I'm not talking about risk taking and danger. I'm talking about things like, I've done Christmas in Afghanistan, Christmas in Iraq, Christmas in Russia. I've missed weddings, I've missed funerals, I've missed bar mitzvahs, I've missed, christenings, you name it. There's a lot of personal sacrifice that comes with doing a job like this because you're on the road a lot, because you're in challenging environments, because you're living overseas. So you have to really, really want it. That's the first piece of advice I give people. Then the second thing I say is if you do want it, don't ever listen to anybody who tries to tell you that you can't have it. Because in the early part of my career, I would tell people I want to be international correspondent. And I remember they would laugh at me. They were like, who do you think you are, kid? And you've got some cojones, like going around saying you want to be, people would make fun of me. They would belittle it. And by the way, that's what people do when they don't have dreams of their own. They belittle other people's dreams. So if you have a dream and you have that fire in your belly, you go for it. You don't listen to anybody. You don't let anyone mansplain or talk down to you. You're humble. You listen. You take advice. You learn. But don't let anybody tell you that something is not an option for you. Because if you have that feeling in your gut, like this is a vocation, this is a calling, this is everything for me, and you're willing to work your guts out, then it will happen for you.
Well,
Whatever we're talking about, by the way, not just my job, like in any field.
it is the start of NFL Sunday, and Clarissa has me ready to run through a brick wall, everybody. So
Yeah.
that was awesome advice there. We're going to go to Jeff and then another journalist, Ting Ting.
Thank you so much for being here. This is really great. Appreciate the chance to hear from you. So when you're in conflict zones, know that one of the other actors who's there will be folks in the humanitarian sector who may be bringing in health or food or infrastructure to civilians who aren't participating in the conflict. I was wondering if you could share any observations about what you've seen in humanitarian aid delivery, maybe a positive story or some of the struggles that they face. Thank you.
So, we obviously overlap a lot with aid workers. And if I sort of try to think of it, they're really the only people who have sort of a similar job to us in the sense that they're the only other Westerners you tend to bump into in war zones, except for military personnel. I'm always impressed by the tenacity of aid workers, by the selflessness and the diligence, and their kind of unwavering focus. They tend to be in a really good way, absolutely laser beam focus on whatever their specific mission is, or the specific area that they're trying to get to. I would also say they're often, and I think this cuts both ways, but they're very generous to us as journalists. And if there's a seat on a plane, if there's a spot in a car, and somebody needs it, or if there's food to share, whatever the situation might be, I've always found them to be incredibly gracious in sharing that. And so, I'm a really huge fan of aid workers, some more than others. There's an very famous Italian called Dr. Gino Strada, who I did a 60 Minutes piece on years ago, who was the head of a formidable NGO called Emergency, which really goes to all the front lines and the most dangerous places. They have several operations around Afghanistan. He very sadly died while I was actually in Kabul covering the fall of the city. But he was an extraordinary individual with incredible vision who set up free heart surgery center in Sudan. He was just a visionary and an incredibly charismatic individual. So, aid workers are not as interested as being on television or being on the spotlight beyond getting attention to whatever cause it is that they're working on. But they really are, many of them, extraordinary people.
Thank you, Jeff. We will go to Ting Ting, a journalist in Taiwan, Taipei. And then after Ting Ting, we will go to Dr. Aditi.
Hi, Clarissa. This is Ting Ting, journalist with TVBS in Taiwan, and I've actually followed your coverage very, very closely this year, and thank you for doing such a fantastic job. And just a small note is there's a lot of discussion and pre-order for your book here in Taiwan, so I'm going to keep my questions short. When you do some of your coverages, one main concern is that you have exclusive access because perhaps a particular government would want to present a false narrative through your network to the world. So how do you manage that or those criticisms that comes with it? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ching Ching. That is a really good question. And I'm guessing you're sort of alluding to my trip to Myanmar in March, at the end of March, beginning of April. So this is something that like every journalist and journalistic organization has to grapple with. What do you do when the only way to get in and cover a story is to do so at the invitation or through a visa granted by a repressive regime, a genocidal regime? How do you deal with that? Do you not go, right? And sort of boycott, basically, that access? Or do you go and make sure that you hold that regime or whatever it may be, whatever sort of group, you hold their feet to the fire? So I think in most places that I've worked, whether it's ABC, CBS, or CNN, we've always believed that the job of journalists is to get in there and hear from all sides, no matter how unappealing some sides might be. So whether that's my colleague Fred Pleitgen going in from CNN, going into Syria with the regime of Bashar al-Assad, or my colleagues at CBS News, Liz Palmer, going into Iran at the behest of the theocracy there, or whether it's me going through the junta into Myanmar earlier this year. I think it's fundamentally important to get into these places and tell these stories. And our trip to Myanmar, while it wasn't without controversy, as you point out, raised a huge amount of attention globally to what was happening in Myanmar that maybe hadn't been there on that level before, particularly in the US, where many Americans just don't know that much about Myanmar. And so the way I think you justify it is by making sure, as I did in this, using this example, you sit down with one of the generals and you hold him accountable. You hold his feet to the fire. You ask him the tough questions. You present him with evidence of children being murdered by his regime, and you make him squirm and you shame him and you get answers from him and you demand the release of prisoners. And this is what I can do as a Western journalist that the incredibly brave journalists in Myanmar, Burmese journalists who had been doing extraordinary, courageous work, cannot do for their own security reasons. They cannot sit down with General Zhao Mintun and hold his feet to the fire, because they would probably end up being arrested. So in my mind, that's the calculation that you make. And I think most large media organizations do actually agree, in the sense that they also go to places like, whether it's Iran or whether it's Syria or whether it's North Korea. There's many examples of conflict zones or countries, repressive regimes, where the only way you can get in is through a visa from that repressive regime. And I still believe fundamentally that it's hugely important to go in anyway, shine a light, tell the story, get global attention, and hold some people accountable while you're there.
Thank you very much for that question. Quick refresher. CNN's chief international correspondent is with us, Clarissa Ward. She's also reported for ABC, CBS, and Fox News. Her book, it is On All Fronts, from Penguin Random House. But I wanted to go to a few more questions, and then we'll get Clarissa's last words. On that note, I want to go to Dr. Aditi and then Andrea.
Thanks so much, Justin. Clarissa, I'm having a total fangirl moment here. It's just wild that you're sharing your experiences. I've worked in global public health. I'm a physician and now work in media. So my question to you, first, I was just floored that you're a mom too. So am I. And I'm just like, what does this woman not do? Honestly. So my question to you is really kind of like an inside job question, meaning, when I watched your COVID coverage of India, it was riveting and it was highly disturbing, even for someone like me who's cared for like thousands and thousands of patients. But that mass scale of suffering and you being there in those, like, when they're burning the body, I mean, the crematoriums, like, just, it was so riveting. And I had like a physical, visceral reaction to it. I can only imagine what you felt being there. How do you, when you go, and then you like moved on to the next job, which was Afghanistan, like with no, without missing a beat. What do you do after something like that, witnessing something like that? You've touched on it, but like, what do you do to either decompress or like get straight again in your head and get centered? Because ultimately, like, you might be bionic, but you are a mere mortal, like all of us, right? So like, of course it impacts you. Yeah. So
Thank you, Dr. Aditi. And your words are, they mean a lot to me. I really appreciate that. It's so nice to hear people the reporting has resonated with. So I am very much a mere mortal, and I have really struggled at times in the past with some of the things I've seen and the people I've lost. And I went through a very dark phase after Syria. Or during Syria, I actually ended up getting professional help, which I think really was hugely important for me in that moment. I'm a big advocate of therapy in general, but I also think like there's lots of different things. So for me, there's not one flip the switch thing, but there's a few. I think it's really important to get tons of sleep. That is a big one for spiraling depression, is exhaustion, and just crashing when the adrenaline leaves you. I also think it's hugely important to spend time with people you love, whether that's your family, obviously my kids, but also go out to dinner with your girlfriends, go to the movies, have a glass of wine, go dancing, whatever it is that feels normal and kind of healthy and comforting and fun and light. It is so important to have some levity in your life, especially when you're doing a job as intense as this. And also on the subject of light, for me, it's really important to have a spiritual practice. And I would say that absolutely keeps me sane. It keeps me centered. Having prayer in my life and having like a ritual that I'm able to do every day, it just gives me a sense of constancy. Some people, it's like exercise for them. I'm also, very grateful for yoga and stretching when I get out of a situation like India. I find that like some stretching, I'll just like start bowling because all this grief, basically, the body like holds on to it and you don't even know it's there. And then suddenly you're doing these stretches and it just comes pouring out of you. And I will say that India was one of the more harrowing, I've covered a lot of horror, obviously, but it was absolutely gut wrenching and so sad. So basically that's your sort of answer. There's many different things that have to be sort of practiced all at the same time. And also you just have to be patient with yourself. It's not going to happen right away. It'll take a bit of time. And it's also okay to feel sad and feel down, and just be patient with yourself, but be checking in with yourself. Have the knowledge to know when you need to reach out and talk to someone, like professionally, I mean.
Thank you, Dr. Aditi. We will have two more questions for last words and focus group. So we're going to go to Andrea and then another friend of the show as well, former President Obama appointee, Dr. and military man, Dr. Dan. So Andrea, over to
Thank you so much, Justin. This is a huge fangirl moment for me, too. Thank you so much, Clarissa. I was an aspiring international correspondent turned, not aid worker, I would say human rights worker, and spent years on the ground in India doing raid and rescues with child slaves and laborers. And
Wow.
your advice is so spot on. I'm a fellow yogi. My question for you today is, how do you balance, I have a million, I'll stick to one. And that question is, how do you balance, how does it work behind the scenes, if you can share without getting in trouble, when you have a story that goes up against national security or intelligence issues, and how does that play out? Love to hear more.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that when you have a story like that, it's definitely a steeper climb, right? Because you can't get it wrong. Like, it has to be right. It has to be ironclad. And I mean, look at what we saw the New York Times did yesterday with this investigation that they put out about the drone strike that killed this entire family in Afghanistan. And the Pentagon had said that it was striking an ISIS-K vehicle laden with explosives. And according to the New York Times investigation, that is not the case. And that's tough, right? You have to make sure that every single I is dotted, every T is crossed, that your information is rock solid, that you have multiple sources. But if you have all that and you know that your reporting is good, then it's ultimately of national interest and, frankly, a form of national service to make sure that that reporting sees the light of the day. And sometimes you'll have to fight for it, definitely, because there'll be moments where it feels uncomfortable, or the timing isn't great, or it's sensitive, or it's awkward. But that's the job of a journalist, is to just say, okay, but here's the story, and we've got to do it. So it's not without its challenges, and I won't pretend it's not. And the bar is high, but I've done a story, for example, in Syria. When was it? 6 years ago, 5 years ago, the CIA had built an airstrip there, and we went and found the airstrip. Now, we weren't releasing information that wasn't already available, in terms of, if you Googled it, you could find the location already. But even that was something like, well, does this look like we're putting Americans' lives in danger? And it's important to have a conversation around the whole thing. And that's why you have standards and practices, departments at many organizations, including CNN, because there are valid conversations and tough conversations to have. But ultimately, we put the story on air. Ultimately, you just saw the New York Times put out that investigation yesterday, or the day before. I think it was yesterday. So, yeah, that would be my answer. Basically, it's tough, and the bar is high, but that doesn't mean you don't get it on TV or in the paper.
you got to do it. So we are really running up against time. I'm going to go, I apologize for that. We're going to go to Dr. Dan. We know he can't be a fan girl. Maybe he's a fan boy, though. And you get the last question, Dr. Dan.
You stole my line, Justin. Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Clarissa, thanks for your leadership on all these issues. I'll cut to the point. I have daughters and a son. But for young women looking up to the wonderful type of work that you've done and understanding the international environment, which is not friendly, my question to you is, what are your thoughts on gender, more specifically, your role as a woman in this position? Do you think it actually gives you leverage to get into these secret areas and the trust that you build with even enemies or foes to whichever, even your thoughts and your morals and your Western perspective of life? Because younger generation of women may feel the empowerment as they should, but in certain areas where you've definitely played and been a role in having those conversations, there is no respect or limited respect. Or how do you do that and maintain your objectivity? And for the young generation coming up, thank you. I'm done.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good question, Dr. Dan. And I mean, in terms of like how it can be an advantage, I would just say like, you know, it's sometimes it's a really helpful thing to be underestimated. And as a woman in many parts of the world, I am consistently underestimated in every way. And that gives me some real opportunities, honestly, because people tend not to see me as much of a threat. They might not take me as seriously. They might view me as more of a curiosity. I might be able to pretend I'm sleeping in the back of a car and go through a checkpoint that could be hostile, where they're not that interested in me because I'm just a lady sleeping in the back of the car, as opposed to a Western male who might attract a lot more attention. So there are a number of advantages, primarily the advantages that I have access in some of these deeply conservative societies to 50% of the population who my male colleagues can't talk to. And I really can't emphasize enough how important I think it is that whenever we're covering conflict, we're talking to women and we're understanding their perspective. So I think you raise another good point about how do you reconcile your own beliefs and your own ideals and things that you hold sacred and your values when you are entering a culture that maybe does not have the same ideals or beliefs or values, that may even have sort of diametrically opposed values. And what I have learned over the years is that it does not make me inferior or any less. It doesn't mean that I hold my values any less dearly. Just because I am willing to sort of check my preconceptions and my judgments at the door and go in with an open mind and listen to people and learn from their perspective. There is no weakness in listening, and there's no weakness in hearing someone out, getting a different sense of how people see the world, how people see America, how people see women. I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to condone it, but it is definitely going to enrich and deepen my understanding of the broader picture. And it will also ideally prevent me, hopefully, from making snap judgments or assumptions, because we're all prone to making assumptions, and that's okay. We're human. But often the assumptions we make as Americans are made from a place of conviction in these ideals that we assume so many other people share. And that gets us into all sorts of trouble, as I think we've seen many times before. And so I have found it really helpful to just occasionally be a listener, be a communicator, a translator, like a vessel almost, rather than trying to challenge or persuade or argue or whatever it might be with another person's point of view. And I think that's really helped me ultimately in my reporting and my understanding of the world.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dan. Folks, we are over the time limit, but it's $18. The book is on all fronts by our esteemed guests today. I've tweeted it out.
And you can get the paperback now, guys, as well. The paperback's out too if you don't want to lug around a hardback.
Yes, the paperback, which I actually just bought, is $18. So it's cheap.
Oh, perfect.
Put it in your carry-on. It'll bend and it'll fold around. But, so that's on all fronts. I did tweet it out. I know that we have other White House correspondents wanting to ask Clarissa questions, but we've got to wrap it up. So Clarissa, first off,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any last words you want to just leave the audience with?
I would just like to say, first of all, thank you all for joining this conversation. I've really enjoyed it hugely. I love just hearing people's voices and being able to chat directly with people who I maybe don't get to meet. So thank you all for your time and for your engagement and for caring about the stories that I'm telling. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being such a gracious host.
Thank you very much, Clarissa.
That's all we have for you today. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to see our schedule of upcoming live guests, maybe join and ask one of them a question, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founder, Justin Higgins, and I, thank you for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.